for those of you who sort of got to page 3 or 4 this week, you may have noticed that along with celebrating the 20th anniversary of the crushing of democracy in China at Tiananmen Square, the OAS convened in Honduras, hosted by a left-leaning member of the ALBA, or the Chavista coalition, which is the Bolivarian Alternative for the Americas. Mr. Zelaya is a full-fledged card-carrying member of the ALBA coalition. Also present were a number of other individuals whose names will be mentioned momentarily. Anyway, the OAS, in its annual convention, was presented with an agenda of about 125 items. The theme of the gathering of 2 days was No to the Culture of Violence in the Americas. I definitely applaud that, that undertaking. They were supposed to do something about Haiti, but they spent most of their time talking about Cuba. And what they focused on was the repeal of the 1962 resolution, which was issued early in that year, which suspended Cuba's membership. From my last visits, I remember they still fly the flag of Cuba in the halls of the OAS, and it is still technically a member, but its membership was suspended in 1962. The U.S. went in trying to sort of keep this off of the agenda, clearly found it an awkward topic with which to deal with. The optimum solution, I think, for the Obama administration was no Cuba amendment at all. Secondly, when Nicaragua and others introduced one simply to repeal the 1962 resolution and to also restore Cuba to full membership, well, this got people in a bit of a dither, I guess, over the State Department. So they introduced a resolution which had talked about a gradual process that would begin a dialogue among members and with the Cubans about bringing them back. And it's about 2 pages, and it has all sorts of preamble talking about the Inter-American Democratic Charter, the Declaration of Rights and Duties of Man, Universal Declarations of Human Rights, and so forth and so on. It's a pretty good piece. It would be a graduated step of discussions with the Cubans talking about their potential return to the OAS. Well, lo and behold, after about a day and a half of negotiations, the text that emerged, the resolution, dropped all the stuff, all the preambles about human rights and everything like that, ended up with basically 2 statements. The first of all is it repealed the 1962 expulsion order and basically cleared the way for Cuba's return to the OAS. However, it did put into that a sort of little subclause, no process, so to speak, but it basically said two conditions. One, that Cuba asks or initiates a discussion for the return to the OAS, and secondly, that, and here is sort of, let me get my little note, the exact transformation, all sort of boils down to one little line, that Cuba's participation in the OAS will result from a process of dialogue started at the request of the Cuba's government and according to the practices, purposes, and principles of the OAS. Now, that is rather sort of, for those who have done some diplomatic drafting, that's rather vague language. It sort of seems to be something you could sort of drive a large truck through. However, it was declared by those present. The secretary had taken off to go to the Middle East, so she left Tom Shannon, the assistant secretary, to announce this glorious victory by the United States against the forces of darkness. The U.S. certainly pointed to this second part of the resolution, to the steps that would be required to begin the process of bringing Cuba back into the OAS. Anyway, the upshot is the press, everywhere else, the jubilation that went on, and I watched about an hour and a half of the webcast of the final session, everybody celebrating a new dawn in the Americas, the wonderful return of Cuba and everything like that, was certainly a celebratory event. Poor Tom Shannon looked like he'd probably been up all night, looked like he was sort of walking in his sleep, and he kept his head down most of the time when he was reading his statement. But on the other hand, we had an upbeat dialogue. Generally, this is a meeting of ministers, but somehow or another, Daniel Ortega magically appears in the midst of all these foreign ministers wearing what looks sort of like a Star Trek suit, in which he goes into one of his usual sorts of rambles. And he said, well, you know, why in the world are you Americans worrying about North Korea? You know, you've got so many missiles up there, you can blow the whole world to smithereens. You know, so Daniel was off on his, and he was very, very happy that the stain had been removed from the inter-American relations. And he said, by gosh, we're going after the embargo next. We'll get you guys. So anyway, you know, the spin back here in the States was, oh, this was a great accomplishment. However, watching the events, reality unfold, does not, seems to be somewhat contrary to reality. In the U.S., the bottom line is, and I'll go very quickly through the few points that I want to make, the stars are definitely aligned against us in the OAS. Clearly, the ALBA group, it's kind of like whack-a-mole. You know, one day it's Chavez. If it's not Chavez, it's Daniel Ortega. If it's not Daniel Ortega, it's Rafael Correa or Evo Morales. They sort of pop up, and their goal is to certainly make life difficult for us in the OAS and in Latin America in general. Will Cuba try to join? Well, the latest state, Castro has usually referred to the OAS as an unburied cadaver. In his reflections on June 3rd, he said, the OAS is nothing more than a Trojan horse that opens the door to neoliberalism, America's militarism, and the likes. So I think that the attitude initially is thanks, but no thanks. We like this recognition that we were right and you were wrong, but we're really not interested in joining your organization. The upshot, another upshot is the possibility, and I think this is something we will be dealing with. For the moment, the administration portrays that it has held the OAS together. It has worked on this. This motion was passed by consensus. They didn't have to force a vote. But as I said, they got a very hollow amendment. They got what is perceived as a victory for Cuba, and a very likelihood that they've simply, I think, bought some time with the OAS. I mean, basically, the ALBA group wants to have its own sort of organization. It knows that as long as the United States, one, sort of controls the keys to the door of the place that we have down there on the ellipse, as long as the United States does exert its influence, even under the Obama administration, it's going to clash with sort of the differences between liberal democracy and these new authoritarian regimes. So ultimately, are we going to see in the next year or two a real serious effort on the part of the ALBA group to create its own organization? And are we going to have the guts enough here in the United States to probably say, can we help you find the door? Can we help you, can we maybe perhaps give you a little seed money to start your new organization? What we're likely to see, however, will be simply the continuing hollowing of multilateralism, in which my basic conclusion is that the ideal of the OAS is something of a community of democracies with self-governing standards and relatively high ideals. But what I think we're really seeing is what we have on our hands is a contentious association of regional nations in which defense of sovereignty, a horror of, and the most absolute sorts of sovereignty that are practiced, the most ridiculous sort practiced by the Chavistas and the like, the horror of so-called interventionism and anti-Americanism will make it possible for the ALBA members to continue to basically neutralize the OAS. I shudder at the thought of Cuban electoral observers, Cuban judges on the Inter-American Human Rights Committee. Somehow or another, it just doesn't come across very well. So clearly, this effort to bring Cuba into the OAS is something I think that is for the moment hinges on what Cuba will do, but I think should they say they want to, I think we're going to see that the OAS will roll over and the U.S. will find itself once again in a very awkward position of having to choose between the sort of runaway multilateralism and a defense of democracy, which Obama even in his speech in Cairo, did highlight. And the message that applies for democracy in the Middle East is a message that can also be applied and should be applied for an island that's only about 90 miles away from us.